This one. And everyone should be able to see the agenda.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Shelby said, the first thing I'm going to discuss is open questions that came up last week. One of them, in a discussion, there was a question about what is required for a provider to submit mental health versus substance use treatment episodes. There is no restriction on that. Any provider can submit any kind of treatment episode, so there's no setup required. So that's the very short and easy answer for that. The next question that came up was quite a bit more complex, and it had to do with parallel admissions or more than one admission at the same time, where a client or a patient was receiving treatment, for example, from two provider sites within the same provider at the same time. So I have a diagram that may be helpful here. And this is actually a good review of sort of how treatment episode works anyway. Shelby, is this diagram showing up on screen?
It is.
Great. So what we have here is an overview of how a provider might structure their data to address the concerns that came up in the email, in the question that I received. So we have here a provider. This would be the provider of services. The provider client. This would be the client or the patient who's coming in. And a couple of treatment episodes, and you can see the arrows linking everything together. So the client comes in. This is treatment episode 1. Treatment episode 1 initiates with admission A. And let's say that's an inpatient admission. And admission A is associated with a performance outcome measure. And I'm sort of doing dual purpose with this diagram. Another thing to point out is admission A creates a discharge, and that closes the admission. So this was the initial admission, and the subsequent admission, admission B, is a transfer admission. The discharge, at the time of discharge, another performance outcome measure was recorded. We're calling that POM2. What I wanted particularly to point out was this arrow, which indicates that a performance outcome measure can be used can be reused for the next action. So if you create it in a discharge, you can reuse that performance outcome measure with the following admission. This would make sense in this context because it's unlikely that if someone's being discharged from inpatient going into outpatient, if this is happening sort of literally within hours, then there's no need to record a new performance outcome measure because it's not likely that anything's going to change in those hours. And I'll get into exactly how that works later in my talk. So treatment episode 1, we have an admission, the initial one, it gets discharged. We have a transfer admission. And in this example, we'll say this transfer admission was an outpatient admission. And during that outpatient admission, which is ongoing, and that's why I wrote ongoing here, this patient needs to be treated for crisis. So they go into crisis care. You don't want to close out this outpatient admission because they are still in that sort of care scenario. So because there is not the ability to create a second parallel admission, our recommendation is to create a second treatment episode for that crisis care. So you would create treatment episode 2 with its own admission. These would both be related to the same provider and same client. And I did confirm there is no rule that prevents multiple treatment episodes for a client at the same time. So you can have multiple treatment episodes. There were other questions in that email, and one of them I think was a similar sort of take on the same question, which was sort of if a client is receiving care from two provider sites within at the same time, and this would be the solution for that as well. So you would create one treatment episode for the first site and another one for the second. I'm seeing a chat coming in. I'm guessing this is related to this. Don't we have to configure WITs to allow for concurrent enrollment for the modality? I'm not sure on that one.
Denise will check on that one.
Yeah, we will check and get back to you. So that's our recommendation for if there are multiple treatment episodes that are concurrent, or excuse me, if a client is in multiple treatment contexts at the same time, we would create multiple treatment episodes. Coming back here, before we dive into the next piece here, are there any other questions that have come up since we last spoke? If there's anything you need to get answered, those were the ones that I was aware of that were unanswered since our last meeting. I'm not seeing anyone. Oh, I'm seeing one. My question, yes, yes, David, I did see that, and yes, multiple programs within the same episode. And the recommendation is to create a second episode, even though the client may be in one episode of treatment within a provider. Structurally within the data warehouse, the recommendation is to create, you say creating a new episode is a problem. In that case, the possible solutions for this are something we probably need to take offline. There are some other ways to look at this, but it's going to go beyond the scope of this call. So we'll take that one offline. We will figure out what the best solution is, and we will get back to you. So the next thing I wanted to go through was a discussion of source record identifier. And this was sort of to address several questions that came up during the last discussion, and to kind of take a deeper dive into source record identifiers, what they are, and how they work. So a source record identifier is a unique identifier for a record. And it can be based upon information within the record. So a client source record identifier might be a concatenation of first name and last name and some other things about the client that may change. And if they do change, that's okay as long as the source record identifier doesn't change. So if you have a client who was called Joe Smith, and Joe Smith changes his name to Joseph Jones, that name change doesn't affect the source record identifier. The source record identifier must stay the same at all times. And you'll see why further on. And it can be arbitrary. You can have, and I'll show some examples of that as well. And as I said, you can't change it once it's been created. It must be unique within the table. You can't have more than one source record identifier that match. And when we're putting data into the data warehouse, if that data is coming in from an EHR, that source record identifier is whatever the unique identifier for that record is in the EHR. And these do come from providers. So when you are submitting data into the data warehouse, you will need to provide a source record identifier. So this is a sort of map of all of the source record identifiers we have, and I tried to color code it to hopefully make it make a little bit more sense. All of these objects have a primary source record identifier: provider, provider site phone, and so on and so forth. And what I've done in here is say which other records each record references. So a provider client has its own source record identifier. And in addition, a provider client record also references the provider source record identifier. And I have this in green just so that you can see that this is the source record for provider, and the provider client record does reference that. And in addition, a treatment episode references the provider and references the client. And you can see I've again color-coded that. And an admission record references the provider site source record identifier. And just to be clear, every source record identifier for a given object doesn't say provider source record identifier or functional assessment source record identifier. Within that table, it's just called source record identifier. If it's referenced from elsewhere, it has that prefix. I saw a couple of questions come in while I was talking about this. I'm going to pause briefly and see if I can address them. This is relevant to all of us. Okay, then I presume that's the question about multiple treatment episodes. Again, we will do some deeper digging on that and look at the options for that. My question had to do with XML formatting. Does the system allow attributes within element tags, or do they need to display as child elements? I actually have an XML example coming up that I think will answer that. If it doesn't, then ping me again and we'll address it. Moving on in source record identifier. So these are some examples, a serial ID, and this would be if you have a database and the first record is 1, the second is 2, and so on and so forth. Then whatever that primary key for that record is, you could send that as a source record identifier. A GUID, which is a global unique identifier, which can be easily generated for a record. And again, as long as they are unique and consistent, those are the two major requirements for a source record identifier. And again, it can be based on source data. So in this example, I have Brockman James David, and then a pipe, and then we'll say, for example, maybe this was the date and time on which the first my first admission record was created. And a bad example would be last name, because that's very unlikely to be unique. The two major uses of source record identifier are maintaining data updates versus data creation, and associating entities within the data warehouse. And we'll talk about these two in order. So the first is data updates. So this is a very, very simplified version of some client data. We have a source record identifier, a provider source record identifier, last name, first name, and date of birth. So on a data update, if we send via XML a source record identifier of 150 and a last name of Williams, when that comes into the data warehouse will first check to see if that source record identifier exists. When it sees that it does, it will update the existing record from Jones to Williams. And the important thing to note here is we are only sending the data that needs to be updated. If you're updating an existing record, you don't have to send the whole record. So here's a very simplified, again, version of what that might look like in XML. So if you had, and these tags are not necessarily right, please don't write them down. This is just to illustrate what the XML might look like. But within a client record, you have a source record identifier of 150 and a last name of Williams. That would be an update in the data warehouse, because that would be an update because that source record identifier of 150 exists. In the case of a new record, here we have the same list from before, and now we have this person's last name was updated. We have a new record that's come in, source record identifier 153. As that XML is processed, the engine determines that 153 doesn't exist, so we need to have a new record added to this list. And here's what that XML might look like. And you see we have to provide all of the data for that record because this is a new record. And if, for example, we have, like we do in the data warehouse, a rule that says last name is required, first name is required, this would create an error if first name was not supplied. This would not create an error because this record does have a first name. The next use of source record identifiers that I wanted to talk about is the way that source record identifiers relate data together. So using that list we had before, and I've kind of shrunk down the last name, first name fields just for clarity, we have a provider client source record identifier and a provider source record identifier. The provider source record identifier references the source record identifier column on the providers table. You see, this is the providers table. So on the providers table, provider with the source record identifier 14 references provider A, and 15 references provider B. And this is speaking to some questions that came up in the last seminar or webinar that had to do with how and when one should send a source record identifier and whether they changed or whether they should change and how they might change. So this is more of a demonstration of that, of how they're used, and hopefully that should answer those questions. This is the second sort of a second example of how source record identifier is used. Here you have, and again, this is very, very, very stripped down, but I just was using this for as an example. A provider treatment episode has its own provider treatment episode source record identifier here. It references a client and it references a provider. So this references client 152 and provider 15. Another important thing to note here is there are some XML validation or some data integrity checks when these records are imported. So first it will say, hey, does this client 152 exist? Yes, client exists, great. Second, does provider 15 exist? Yes, provider 15 exists. Third, is provider one or is client 152 part of provider 15? If this relationship doesn't exist, you would get a data validation, or I think it's a data linkage error is actually what it's called, saying that, hey, this provider may exist, but it doesn't, or excuse me, this client may exist, but it doesn't exist within this provider, and that you get an error when you try to import that XML. We have one more bit to cover. I did see a few more questions come in, or actually it was just one. Does the discharge record need to have only the admission source record sent or resend the entire admission record? Great question. My understanding is that the discharge is that when you're sending a discharge for an admission, if the admission exists, you can just reference the admission with a source record identifier and just say, admission source record identifier, here's the discharge. And that's actually a great segue to go into what we're about to talk about. So I know this is a ton to look at. Shelby, I know you're the only one not on mute. And if people on chat want to weigh in on this, is this visible?
I can see it fine. I also
Okay.
have a pretty large screen.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm seeing in the chat that people can see it. Okay. So I know this is a ton of information, but I wanted to show sort of an actual live XML that so you could see what it's actually going to look like when it goes into the data warehouse. And I'll try to walk through this reasonably quickly. We're moving along in time, but I wanted to cover this. So within the treatment episode data set, you have a block of provider treatment episodes. And this is, I talked, I think it was 2 webinars ago, about you have an object that contains multiple instances, and then you have the instances within that object. So you have treatment episodes, then you have one episode record within that. And the next tags that come in, and I think this is responding to how things are structured in the XML, which does the system allow attributes within element tags, or do they need to display as child elements? This is how you would need to provide the attributes. So if that doesn't answer your question, let me know in chat, and I'll take it offline to see if I can get a clearer answer. So you have a source record identifier, and because we are in the provider treatment episode object, this is the treatment episode source record identifier. We have a provider source record identifier that identifies which provider, a client source record identifier that identifies the client, and we have some other information, contact date, county code, about the treatment episode. Now I've put some comments in here to sort of guide the discussion through this. So again, this is within the treatment episode here. Now we have an admissions container that contains all of the admissions. Here's the first admission, and you can see, and this is one of the things I like about Notepad++, you can see the beginning and end tag, so it automatically highlights it. So everything between these 2 tags is that first admission. This is the admission source record identifier, admission date. The type code is noteworthy here. 1200.1 is the initial admission. And there would be, I just for clarity, I've stripped out a whole bunch of data here just so that I could make this as clear as possible. So there are a lot more data elements you would need to send as part of the admission, but I did want to show some of the data elements for the admission. So we have an admission date and a type code. Within the admission record, we have a discharge record. And it's noteworthy that the discharge isn't in that multiple container. You don't have a discharges container and then discharge. And the reason for that is that there's only one discharge per admission. So you only have that one discharge object. And then within the discharge, and this is, I put a note in here, the discharge for the first admission, the source record identifier of the discharge date, last contact date, the reason. And this is an area for performance outcome measures within the discharge. So here's the only performance outcome measure for the discharge with a source record identifier, a performance outcome measure date, and just as an example, I put in a marital status code. This is the end of the performance outcome measure, end of the performance outcome measures block, the end of the discharge. Then within the admission, we have another performance outcome measure block, or measures block, and this is the performance outcome measure for the admission. Now, I want to do something just to sort of show a point, because this was another thing that did come in via email about the order of data elements. If I take this here, yeah, and move it up here, from a system perspective, that makes no difference. The order in which the data elements are listed doesn't matter as long as they are within the correct objects. And so this performance outcome measure is, as I said, part of the admission. You can see here's the admission, and inside that is the performance outcome measure. I could move this block up to here. And if I fix the formatting so it doesn't look terrible, that would be fine. That would be fine, and it would still be the performance outcome measure within the admission. If I move this performance outcome measure section inside the discharge, then we would get a problem. We would have a problem because we'd have two performance outcome measures section. If I move this performance outcome measure record into here, into the performance outcome measures in discharge, it would then be a performance outcome measure associated with the discharge and not the admission. So in terms of the order within an entity, the order of objects doesn't matter, but in terms of making sure that the object is inside the correct parent object, yes, the order does matter a lot. So I hope that answers that question. The other point I wanted to make goes back to the example I made about another that I had on this page, and for now, ignore this, ignore the purple part. We have a treatment episode with an admission and a discharge. Our second admission, you remember, referenced the same performance outcome measure as the discharge. And here's how we do that. We have, remember, we have the admissions container, and within that we have the first admission, and here's the second admission with a source record identifier, an admission date, a type code of 1200.2, which is transfer. Then we have that performance outcome measures container, and within that we have a performance outcome measure, and we only have the source record identifier. Because we only have that source record identifier, and this one is a direct copy of this one, we're actually reusing that existing performance outcome measure that we had in the discharge. And to answer the question from earlier, if you are sending an update that an admission was now discharged, what you should be able to do is say, and I'm just going to type this sort of ad hoc and hope that it works. So we have an admission. None of this stuff matters at this point because we already have that in the system. So you can say this admission has this source record identifier, and then you could say discharge, and then you would have, we'll say, that's but so this is what that would look like. So you would just reference that you have this admission, here's the source record identifier, and we've added a discharge section to it. You don't need to add all of the information for the admission again. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, so unless there are questions on source record identifiers or anything that I've just been speaking about, I'm going to move on to getting back to the treatment episode document. And I am not seeing any, so we're going to go to the just as a return to where we were. This is the diagram, and I know this is a ton of information, but this is the diagram of provider treatment episodes for the Mississippi Data Warehouse, and you have some sort of top level data for the treatment episode. Within the treatment episode, you have admissions and discharges, and getting into the beginning of admission was where we were last time. And we have a question: do we need a performance outcome measure with every admission and every discharge? I am pretty sure, and we can check that in the document, but yes, I believe you need to have at least one performance outcome measure with every admission and every discharge. So that's a great question, and actually, when we can check here, yes, so to answer your question, for admission at least, admission must have outcome measure rule. So yes for admission, and we can actually look in discharge real quick, and discharge must have single outcome measure. So an admission must have at least one performance outcome measure, and a discharge must have exactly one performance outcome measure. Great question. So where we were last time was looking at admission, and this is a little bit of review. We have initial admissions and transfer admissions, and again, the current rule is that any subsequent admissions must have all previous admissions discharged before you can create the new one. You can't have more than one initial admission for a program area. And this is sort of in keeping with that only one active admission per treatment episode per program area rule. Again, the admission must have at least one performance outcome measure. To answer your question, you can have multiple performance outcome measures for an admission. You may only have one performance outcome measure per discharge, and you must have exactly one performance outcome measure per discharge. And that's addressing the question in chat. So this may have been where the question came up. Correct provider site type, correct provider site identifier type. Each substance use or mental health admission must be related to a provider site, and the provider site identifier type code for that must correspond to the program area of the admission. So it wasn't providers, it was actually provider sites. The provider site, if we go to, I don't have it up now, but if we were to look at the admission, the provider document, there is a row in there that talks to provider site, and where that flag is that says whether it's a mental health admission provider or a substance use provider. Admission substance use entity if substance use program rule. So there is a subsection of admission called admission substance use, and that's required if the admission is for substance use. And similarly, there's a mental health section that's required if the admission is a mental health admission. The admission date must be greater than the client date of birth, and that's just sort of a sanity check data rule, making sure that that the client date of birth and admission date are generally compatible. Finally, and this is a warning, which means if this error is triggered, excuse me, if this error is triggered, the data will still import, but but you will get an error in the portal, or excuse me, a message in the portal saying that this message was triggered, but it will allow the import. And so that's at least one functional assessment is required for each initial admission. So going into the fields of the admission, excuse me. Again, we have the admissions source record identifier, and we've talked extensively about that. The admission is related to a single provider site. And here's that linkage validation that I mentioned in my previous discussion about source record identifier. And the message you would get for a provider site would be either we can't find a provider site record. So if you say provider site 150, if you say the source record identifier for the provider site is 150, and that record doesn't exist in the provider site table, you'll get an error saying that's an unknown provider site. If it does exist in the provider site table, but isn't associated with the provider source record identifier then for the treatment episode. So the treatment episode has a provider, and if that provider site is not part of the treatment episode's provider, then you'll get an error saying this isn't a valid provider site for the provider of the treatment episode. Next is admission date, which I think is pretty straightforward. It is required, and it must be less than or equal to the current date. The type code, we talked about this. It's from the Mississippi code system for the admission type value set, and that's just initial or transfer. And once again, these rules, the data type is pretty straightforward. This is a string, and if it's not a string, you'll get an error. Vocabulary validation, that just goes against the vocabulary code list that you have. And if, for example, I think it's 1200 is the admission type value set. So 1200.1 is initial, I think, and 1200.2 is transfer. So if you sent 1200.3, it would say unknown code for admission type. And this is required. The program area code indicates whether it's substance use or mental health. And that is also validated against the program area vocabulary. That is also required. Codependent code. And this is another one of these that references a shared value set that we talked about. So this is references the no yes value set. And you see the difference here. The program area code references the program area value set, whereas the codependent code doesn't have its own value set. There's a value set called no yes, and that's where the selection values for that would come from. So codependent code is what the code indicating whether treatment is for the client's problem or arises from the client being associated with someone who is having this issue. So that is required if this is a substance use admission, and you can send it if it's mental health. It won't break anything, but it is required if it's substance use, and it must be valid, which is it must be no if the program area is mental health. So if you do send it for mental health, it would need to be no. The next code is, are there co-occurring mental and substance use disorders? And that's just another no, that one is no, yes, unknown. We have several variants of the shared vocabulary sets. So the co-occurring mental and substance use is either no, yes, or unknown. It is required. Days waiting to enter treatment code, days waiting to enter treatment known code. We have several of these pairs of fields here of known code and number. And the way these work is rather than making this field required, the way the data warehouse works is for fields like this where we want to know authoritatively, yes, the client said that they didn't know it, or the client wouldn't provide it, or whatever it is. So we have a known code that handles whether or not they know this information. If that is no, you must not provide the number field. If that is yes, then you must provide the data field. So this is required for an initial admission. And then days waiting to enter treatment number is not required unless you said that you knew it. If you say the known code is yes, then days waiting to enter treatment number is required if the known code is yes. Then you must not send it unless it's yes. So if you said no, or you didn't leave, or you left or somehow left this blank, for example, on a non-initial admission. So if the known code is not yes, that would be no or blank, then you must not send a value for the number, because that would conflict with the statement that you didn't know it. And it must be valid integer. So it's an integer greater than or equal to 0. You can't have negative days waiting for treatment. That was a lot of information there fairly quickly. I'll pause here, see if there are any questions. I didn't see any come in as I was talking. So I'll pause just a moment before we go on. I'm not seeing any come in. Please feel free to just type them in as I'm talking, and I'll get to them at the next pause. The next section is admission substance use. And if we go back to our diagram, we can see we're here in admission, and there is the ability to have exactly one of these records. And you can tell that because here's one of those multiple holders for performance outcome measure. And so you have the single entry in here and the container which contains them here. But here we just have the single entry. So you can have the admission substance use section and the admission mental health section. And again, substance use is required if this is a substance use admission, and mental health is required if this is a mental health admission. So we're now looking at admission substance use. And this is pretty straightforward, that the substance use record, admission substance use record, is more detailed substance use information, and an admission may either contain none or one of them. You can't have multiple, but you don't have, it's an optional part of the record that is governed by rules. The specific one is if it's substance use, you must include this section. And an admission substance use record will be uniquely identified in the data warehouse by the admission it supports. So that's sort of saying that admission substance use doesn't have its own source record identifier, and that's because this record is always contained within an admission. Within admission substance use, we have a prior substance use episode known code. And again, we have, generally when you see a known code, you're going to see a number right below it. So we have the prior substance use episode known code, and that indicates whether you know it or not, and that's a no, yes. And it is required if this is a substance use record. And since we're only creating this object if this is a substance use record, then if we're creating the admission substance use section, this is going to be required. Prior substance use episode count, it's required if it's known, and you can't send it if it's not known. So these are, and then it must be valid, which means it must be greater than 0. These are fairly standard rules for all of the integer fields that have the known code associated with them. So if you do know it, you have to send it. If you don't know it, you can't send it. The level of care, code, and this is the code indicating the level of care for which they're being admitted. So this would be the substance use level of care. And it's required if this is a substance use program. And this comes from the ASAM level of care value set. So this would just need to be a valid ASAM level of care for substance use. Similarly to so the substance use section, the admission mental health section is required if this is a mental health admission. And similarly to the substance use level of care, we have a treatment setting code in the mental health um, object, and this would be the treatment in which the setting in which the client is receiving treatment, and it is required if this is a mental health admission. And this is the second part of the question that I came in to at the beginning, which is which had to do with multiple parallel admissions. And again, we're going to take that offline and see if we can find some other answers for you. Moving on, if this is important to note, this sentence here, discharge is a sub-entity of admission. And that just means that the discharge record is part of a particular admission. So you cannot have a discharge, you cannot have multiple admissions use one discharge record. Again, we saw back in this example, we have multiple records associated with a performance outcome measure, and that's fine, that's acceptable, that does work, but any discharge is only relevant to one admission. And so that line here, this is a subentity of admission, is pretty important. This says that this is part of the admission record. And I think everyone on this call knows what a discharge is. The discharge is uniquely identified by its source record identifier. And we have one additional business rule here, which speaks to the question that came up earlier, which is that the discharge must have exactly one source record, exactly one outcome measure associated with it. Question came in, why does discharge need a source record identifier if there's only one discharge per admission? That is a great question. And I will have to get back to you on that. I'm not sure. The other question that came in, the guide shows the admission subentity first and performance outcome measure second. The schemas you provided on the DMH website left the performance outcome measure first and the admissions. Which order is the correct order, or does it matter? Yeah. Let me go back to my XML example, and hopefully that will explain it. So the diagram I think you're referring to, so it's tough because performance outcome measure can be used in multiple places. So you can have a performance outcome measure outside the context of an admission. You can have a performance outcome measure associated with an admission. You can have multiple of them. And you can have a performance outcome measure associated with a discharge. And so where you put the performance outcome measure section in the XML is important in the context of which parent it's associated with. So let me just reread your question and then come back to the XML. The guide shows the schemas you provided on the DMH website list the performance outcome measure subentity first and admission second. So the important thing to keep in mind is the performance, where you put a performance outcome measure is where it needs to be. So if you have a performance outcome measure here, that is associated with this admission because it's directly inside that admission. But we have a performance outcome measure here that is inside this discharge, and so it's associated with that discharge. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat. Coming back to the submission guide. The discharge does have a source record identifier, and David, yes, I did see your question. We'll come back to you on that. The discharge date is the date when the client was discharged. It's required. It must be less than or equal to the current date. You can't say that someone is going to be discharged in the future. And it must be greater than or equal to the admission date. So you can't have someone discharged before they were admitted. And that's just one of those sort of data integrity checks to make sure that the discharge date is valid. Last contact date is pretty self-explanatory, and some fairly straightforward rules on that. It's required, and it must be less than or equal to the current date, and it must be greater than or equal to the admission date. The discharge reason, and there is a lengthy value set of discharge reasons in the vocabulary list, and you would just select the correct code, and the discharge reason fairly obviously is required. The next section is functional assessment. And so if we go back to our diagram, we're now looking at functional assessment, and you can see that there can be multiple functional assessments within an admission. The submitting treatment, excuse me, describes the general circumstances under which this data must be submitted, and there's some information about how and when to get them, and this is important. Functional assessment data will be submitted many times, so you can and will have multiple functional assessment records within an admission and a treatment episode. And let's see if we can find those functional assessment. So we need at least one functional assessment required for each initial admission. And I think that's the rule it was referring to. So if we come back here, within functional assessment, we have another source record identifier. We have a type code, the type of functional assessment that's been performed. And the type code should be valid for the age. So the type code, the type code should be valid based on the client's age, and that's calculated based on the birth date and the date upon which the functional assessment was completed. The completed date is the date upon which the functional assessment was completed. And again, some fairly straightforward date rules on this. The score number is required unless the assessment type is no assessment. So if you did perform an assessment, unless it was incomplete or there was no assessment performed, then there must be a score. And the score number must be valid for the type score range. So whatever the valid range is, you shouldn't be submitting a score number that's outside those bounds. And it must be a valid data type for the type of assessment that's being performed. And the example here is, the example here is that, excuse me, if there's no assessment, then it's not required. If there is a valid assessment, the functional assessment type value set in vocabulary will indicate which data types are valid for each kind of score, or for each type of assessment. The reason for the functional assessment, and again, that's just another vocabulary type, and it is required, again, unless it's no assessment. The date of the necessitating event, and some fairly straightforward rules on the date, just sort of the standard ones we have. The guidance here is just noting that because the event necessitating an assessment triggers the start, and an assessment can take up to a week, up to 7 business days, this will not likely be the same as the completed date. So it is both expected and acceptable for the necessitating event date to be different from the completed date. And we're going to try to get into some of performance outcome measure. And again, this section here, it's only 3 lines, but this is important to note. The performance outcome measure can be provided as part of a treatment episode, an admission, or a discharge. It is a valid subentity of all 3 of those objects. I'm getting 2 questions that I want to get, just try to get these in while we're all on the phone. I understand the performance outcome measure can occur within the admission and discharge, but the performance outcome measure occurs outside of these two subentities. Two main subentities, admission, both of these subentities have further subentities like performance outcome. Initial performance outcome measure, does it go before the admission or after? So the initial performance outcome measure would go inside the admission. If you had a performance outcome measure that was not associated to an admission or a discharge, you could put that within the treatment episode. But if you have an initial performance outcome measure for the initial admission, that would go inside the admission. Good question. So the next one is there a list of acceptable score numbers for the functional assessments? I believe that is in the vocabulary. And I can try to pull that up quickly. And if I can get there quickly, I'll do it. Give me just a minute. See if I can pull that vocabulary up for you. Thanks, Shelby.
You're welcome.
So here is the list of vocabulary. There we go, dataset code values. So if we go down to functional assessment reason, functional assessment. So what was the question again? A list of acceptable score numbers for the functional assessments. I will have to get back to you on where that was. I thought it was in the vocabulary and it's not. Can we count on the schema on the DMH website being in the correct order? Again, the performance outcome measure section should be provided as is necessary, as is related to the appropriate object. So the performance outcome measure was put where it was, sort of as one of the possible places it could be, rather than having a performance outcome measure in every subsection. But you would need to populate the performance outcome measure in the appropriate place it needs to be. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't. And so I think with just a few minutes left, I'm going to just generally speak about the performance outcome measure and try to sort of get a deeper explanation on this. If we go back to the diagram here, we do have, and I think this is sort of where the order on the scheme, so if we're not sending an admission, we could just send a performance outcome measure. Correct. If you don't have an admission, you could send a performance outcome measure that's not associated to an admission or a discharge. If after that you had an admission, you could associate that admission to the performance outcome measure you created by referencing its source record identifier. And so here are sort of the three places that can exist. You have the treatment episode, and you have this sort of unassociated performance outcome measure here that's not associated to an admission or a discharge. And then you see this object is repeated here and here. So you can have a performance outcome measure associated with an admission and with a discharge. And you can have multiple performance outcome measures associated with an admission. And those structurally multiple performance outcome measures, from a structural perspective, would be associated with a discharge. There's a business rule that says exactly one must be provided, so you can only provide one. And okay, Bobby is asking about the schema. And so I hope that explains it. Let me pull up the XML and just try to reference this one more time. So I'm not going to put the whole piece in here. In fact, I'm going to do, no, I'm not going to do a new one with 4 minutes left. But here we are within provider treatment episode. We could put a performance outcome measure record here with some details. If we did that, that would be a performance outcome measure that does not reference or that's not associated with a specific admission. And again, if you have an existing performance outcome measure that you've sent, you can just reference it in a subsequent admission or discharge within that episode. All right, I think that is where I'd like to wrap up, unless there are any more questions. I don't want to get too deeply into performance outcome measure and sort of get stopped in the middle. So thank you everybody for your time. A lot of questions did come up, and I will get back to you with answers as soon as I can. All right, thanks, Bobby.
Thanks, James. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.